be opening up to Acts 23 this morning. Acts chapter 23, that's where we are. We're making a lot of progress in the book of Acts, and we have just a few more chapters left. Acts 23 has 35 verses, and it's just a continuation of what we've been talking about the past couple of weeks here at the tail end of the book of Acts. Acts 23 is still continuing the account of Paul's arrest in Jerusalem. When you think back to chapter 21, Paul entered the city of Jerusalem, and there was this great uproar that was caused because of what they had alleged that Paul was teaching and preaching about Judaism. And when they saw Paul in the temple, they accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which of course was not true. And so this great uproar is caused, and the Romans step in, they arrest Paul, and they begin to take Paul back to the barracks to question him. But as they're taking Paul back, Paul reveals that he is a Jew. And Paul asks for the opportunity to address his accusers. And that's where Acts 21 comes to a close. Paul is able to turn back, now bloody, having been beaten by those Jews, the Romans standing nearby, and he addresses his accusers. All throughout chapter 22, last week's class, he's addressing the very Jews who have been beating him and trying to kill him. And as they were listening, Paul eventually came to Acts 22, verse 21, and revealed that God, in his defense, has called him to preach to the Gentiles. And you recall last week when they heard the word Gentiles, they stopped listening. And they began this uproar once again. And thus the Romans have had enough. They've got to get to the bottom of this. They must figure out who Paul is, why the Jews are so upset with him. And they then try to take him back to the barracks. And they tie him up. And what do they begin to do? What process do they start with him? They were going to interrogate him, but how? Through what method? Scourging him, that's exactly right. They had bound him, and they were about to begin this interrogation process to come to the bottom of this through scourging him. But then Paul revealed what about himself that halted the entire process? That he's a Roman, exactly right. And of course, as we talked about last week, Romans could be bound and could be beaten provided they had first had a fair trial. Paul has not had a fair trial yet. And thus they bound him unlawfully, and they began this process to scourge him unlawfully. And he appeals to his Roman citizenship as an act of self-defense, really. Well, now it's where chapter 23 comes in. To have this proper trial, legally you must first have what? If you're going to try someone for a crime, isn't it the case there must first be some charges? To have a person put on trial and be accused and therefore be sentenced eventually, that person first has to have official charges brought against them. Well, here in Acts 23 this morning, Paul is before the Sanhedrin Council. The Romans, now realizing he's a Roman citizen, realizing they can't interrogate him and do all these things without official charges, they have to have some kind of a way to have charges brought against him. And so in Acts 23, they call an informal meeting of the Jewish Sanhedrin together, and they begin this process of bringing formal official charges against the Apostle Paul. Notice our outline. We'll fill those 3 Roman numerals in, then we'll go back and we'll consider them individually here in a minute. But as Paul's before the Sanhedrin Council, and eventually all of that just dissolves, and the Romans have to do something else. First of all, we have Paul and the council, verses 1 to 11. Paul and the council. As we're going to see in a few moments, this meeting does not last long. Paul before the Sanhedrin Council, it was a very hostile meeting from the very beginning, and Paul perceived that it was not going to go well as far as him trying to preach the gospel to these individuals, and so it's dissolved. Then, picking up in verse 12 to 22, Roman number 2, we have Paul and the conspirators. Paul and the conspirators. We have, following this dissolved meeting, a group of Jews that begin to conspire to kill Paul. So Paul and the conspirators, verses 12 to 22. And then that leads us to number 3, verses 23 to 35, Paul and the captain. That will be the Roman captain of the soldiers. Because of this conspiracy to kill Paul, they have to act. They have to get Paul away from these Jewish people. And they send Paul to Caesarea, and in essence the Roman captain says, I can't handle all this. This situation is just escalating steadily, and I'm going to now recommend this into the hands of Felix, the governor of the province. And if they have charges, let them bring these charges against Paul to the governor named Felix. So Paul and the captain. So Paul and the council, verses 1 to 11. Number 2, Paul and the conspirators, verses 12 to 22. And then Paul and the captain, verses 23 to 35. Now let's go back and let's think about this as we continue this series of events unfolding, taking Paul from Jerusalem, being bound there, to eventually, at the end of this book, ending up in Rome and being imprisoned. Paul is now in this process before the Sanhedrin Council. Let's begin, and somebody just read verses 1 to 5, and notice how this situation begins before the council.
And Paul earnestly beholding the council, and said, Men and brethren, I have lied in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded him to stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, God to smite thee, thou white wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to smite him, contrary to the law. And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God, high priest? Then said Paul, I wish thou, brethren, that ye was the high priest, for it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people.
All right, so point A there, Paul's before the council, and Paul rebuked the high priest. That's amazing how this situation begins. Paul's before the council, verses 1 to 11, and here in verses 1 to 5, it begins with Paul rebuking the high priest. Now again, Paul has been brought before this Sanhedrin Council. The Romans have called this informal meeting of the council because they realize they can't bind him and question him through interrogation and thus try him without some formal official charges. In order to receive that, they have to assemble this council and let them set forth to them the things that Paul's guilty of, the accusations they have against him. And notice there in verse 1 how Paul begins this address not in a hostile way. Paul didn't initiate this hostility. Paul began this in a very respectful manner. He calls them brothers there in verse 1. We talked about last week in Acts 22, whenever he addressed the Jewish people themselves who had just beaten him and tried to kill him, he began that address to them in the very same way, brothers and fathers, Acts 22 verse 1. Very humble, respectful way, showing their same ancestry, their same heritage. Paul's not being ugly as he addresses them. And he reminds them as he begins his address to the council now, that all throughout his life he has lived before God with a crystal clear conscience. And that would even include that time whenever he was acting as a very zealous Pharisee, a very zealous Jew, and he was persecuting Christians. Paul says, I did all of that with a crystal clear conscience. Notice that we all have a conscience. Every one of us has a conscience. That's something built into who we are and what we are. That separates us from the animal world. We've been made in God's own image. And part of God's own image is the fact that we have free moral agency, we have emotions, we have intellect, we have a conscience. A lot of that's wrapped up in that concept. That differentiates us from the animals. We have that inner conscience that God's put within us. And of course, it can be violated. It can be so violated that no longer it works. As the Word of God says, like searing it with a hot iron. You take that hot iron and put it on your flesh, and it begins to burn the outer layer, then the inner layers, until it burns all of them. That's the point. When you violate your conscience one time, you're burning the outer layer. And you keep on making those decisions to violate your conscience. Before long, you don't even feel it. It doesn't even bother you anymore. We all have a conscience. And as Paul points out here, all throughout his life, even that time when he was killing Christians, all throughout his life, he's had a crystal clear conscience. So that shows us that though we have a conscience, and we ought to be training our conscience is not always reliable. Because we can have a crystal clear conscience and be wrong in God's eyes. Paul is an evidence of that. He's always lived with a crystal clear conscience. I have lived my life before God in all good conscience, Paul says. But before Paul could even continue with his address, no doubt, like he did in Acts 22, talking about his former life of persecuting Christians and how God stepped in and God called him to be a preacher of the gospel, how God then called him away from the Jews to the Gentiles. Before any of this could be said, something very hostile happens here in this little council meeting. What did the high priest command one of his little men to do to Paul? Strike him. To strike him, to hit him in the mouth. Paul's just trying to very respectfully begin his address. And before he can even really begin it, the high priest orders that one of the men nearby him just reach out and hit Paul in the mouth. That's hostile. That's undue hostility. That's against the law hostility. And notice what Paul happens. Paul rebukes the high priest here. This high priest, his name was Ananias. Not to be confused with Ananias who taught Paul the gospel. There's a great contrast between those two characters. One was a faithful Christian. This Ananias, is far from a faithful Christian. One source regarding him says that in history he was known for accepting bribes. He was covetous. He was evil. One writer has even called Ananias a thug on the judge's bench. He's a thug on the judge's bench. And here he is, before Paul could even get words out of his mouth, really, commanding Paul to be hit in the mouth. That's so rude. That's so against the law. That's so violent. That's just trying to intimidate Paul, just trying to bully him, just trying to shut him up, really. And I find it amazing that Paul here bypasses the one who actually hit him in the mouth. And he talks to the high priest. What does he call the high priest in verse 3? A whitewashed wall. Does that not remind you of Matthew chapter 23 when Jesus called the Pharisees whited sepulchres? They're like whitewashed walls that appear so clean, but on the inside they're full of dead men's bones. You know, that sepulchre is so good and so pretty, but on the inside it's full of evil, full of dirtiness. That's what these folks are. That's the way this man is. Paul's saying, you are a hypocrite. That's what he's calling him. That's Paul's way of saying, you are a hypocrite, Ananias. And he said God's going to do what to him? Prophetically speaking now, he says, you're a hypocrite, Ananias, and you just hit me, you just struck me, but God's going to do what to you? God's going to smite you. Now, I find this amazing because Paul is speaking prophetically here. During the attack of Sychari, as recorded by Josephus, assassins came in and to Jerusalem, and Ananias was hiding like a coward. He was hiding in the sewer. And Josephus, this Jewish historian of that day and time, recalls how those assassins found him, they dragged him out of the sewer, and they murdered him. He says, you just hit me, but God's going to strike you down one day. You are a hypocrite. Now, those bystanders, those who are present, they're shocked, aren't they? That Paul would talk to the high priest that way? That Paul would say those things to the high priest? And Notice what happens there. Verse 4, those who stood by said, would ye revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Paul here reveals in verse 5 that I did not know he was the high priest. And there's a lot of debate about what Paul meant by that. Some would say that Paul did not recognize that this man was the actual high priest. That perhaps because it was an informal meeting, they weren't in their garb of the meeting usually. We're not told all of that. But we do know this, and I lean towards this view based on what happens and how this situation escalates. The word know there, when Paul says in verse 5, I did not know that he was the high priest. The word know there comes from the Greek word that's very specific. And it denotes the idea of acknowledging or having regard for. So in essence, what Paul is saying is, I am not acknowledging that man as God's high priest. Who is God's high priest, by the way, today? Just as it was then? Jesus Christ. Not this wicked, hypocritical man named Ananias. You see, that role was not just a civil role, it was also a spiritual role. There were spiritual connotations to that. Paul says, this man is not the high priest of God. I don't recognize this man as God's high priest. Paul's further, in essence, rebuking this man. Well, notice what happens there in point B. Somebody pick up in verse 6, and notice that Paul divides the Sanhedrin. Paul divides the Sanhedrin. He's rebuked now the high priest, and now he divides the Sanhedrin. Somebody read verses 6 to 11.
But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the castle. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome.
All right, so Paul divides this council meeting. Paul, in political tact, realizing that he can't get any further with these individuals, it's a hostile environment. He's going to get nowhere trying to preach the gospel here. He resorts now to dividing this assembly to, in essence, save his skin, to be able to get out of this situation. Notice there in verse 6, the Bible says that Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees. The fact that Paul perceived, that suggests that Paul was reading his audience. Paul's reading his audience, and Paul knows that it's already a hostile environment. One not very conducive to preaching the gospel. I mean, after all, the high priest, just shortly after Paul opens his mouth, has Paul hit in the mouth. And the people are just shocked that Paul would address the high priest in that way. So, because of the actions and attitudes here among this crowd, it's not very conducive to preach the gospel. Paul perceives that. And furthermore, as Paul reads his audience, he sees that, as we've said before in this class, in much earlier chapters, the Sanhedrin Council was comprised of Pharisees and Sadducees. And so Paul perceives this, and he tries to use this, and does use this, for his own benefit. What differentiates the Pharisees from the Sadducees? Well, a lot of things really do, but partly their views do, and that the Word of God brings that out here. That these Sadducees, according to verse 8, did not believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in man's spirit. But on the other hand, the Pharisees, they believe in the resurrection. They believe in angels, and they also believe in man's spirit. So their views really make them different. And Paul, knowing all of that about them, tries to use that to pit them against each other. And so he brings up the fact in verse 6 that his background is that of a Pharisee. He can identify, therefore, with these Pharisees. He's trying to play off of that and use that. And he says, I actually am here on trial because of what? What does he bring up that he's been preaching that is one of the main reasons why he's being accused? There in verse 6.
Because of the resurrection of the dead.
That's exactly right, Etta. Because of the resurrection of the dead. He says, I'm here on trial right now, as a Pharisee, from this background, just as you are, and I'm being accused because I'm preaching the resurrection from the dead. Now, Paul had been preaching that. And, of course, the Pharisees, they see nothing wrong with that. If that's the case, that he's being accused because of just preaching the resurrection, well, we believe that. We agree with that. But the Sadducees, on the other hand, would not. And so that caused this, verse 9, this great clamor arose, this great uproar arose, and it was so sharp that those Romans thought that if this situation continues, they're in such a frenzy, they're going to just kill Paul right now. They're going to just tear Paul into pieces right now. And so the soldiers put it to an end. They take Paul away from this situation. So Paul has successfully diffused this situation as far as getting himself out of it. They're in an uproar now. They're fighting among themselves, and Paul's able to get out of this situation. Well, that does not end Paul's dealings with these Jews. It doesn't end there, because in verses 12 to 22, we have Paul and the conspirators. There are some Jews who now begin to conspire against him. Notice point A. A group of men vow to kill Paul. Once Paul is removed from this situation by the Romans, this plan begins to be created to kill Paul. Some Jews begin to conspire to kill Paul. Somebody read, picking up in verse 12, down to verse 15 for us.
When it was day, so the Jews lay together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you therefore together with counsel suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him, but we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barrack and told Paul.
All right, notice, before we talk about this section here, notice back in verse 11, what happens. Once the situation went very south with a council meeting, and Paul's able to get away from that, but before this plot is created to kill him, something major happens between these two events. What happens in verse 11? That's right, God spoke to Paul. The Lord came and stood by him, the Bible says. That's amazing. And was it a message of comfort, or was it a message of discomfort? Comfort, that's right. He says to take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, where will he also go and testify about God? In Rome. So, does that not imply that he's going to live through whatever happens in Jerusalem? Don't be alarmed, Paul. Some bad things are happening, but I'm with you. I'm standing by you, Paul. Be courageous. You've done well here in Jerusalem. And I'm going to be by you as you do the same thing for me in Rome. The Lord's comforting him. And in the Lord's comfort, there is the implication that you're going to live through this. You're going to survive what happens to you in Jerusalem. You're going to live, and you're going to make it to Rome. Well, amazingly, the very next verse talks about this plot to kill Paul. God says, I'm going to be with you, Paul, and protect you. You're not going to die here. I'm going to be with you so you can go to Rome and testify there also. But man's plan is I'm going to kill him. I'm intent on killing him. And these Jews, around 40 of them, make this conspiracy, and they put themselves under an oath. They vow to not eat or drink until Paul dies. So in other words, it's going to be Paul or us. Who's going to die first? Will we die first or will Paul? We're not going to eat or drink until we've killed him. And placing themselves under an oath, that's a major thing. That's a huge deal in that day and time, to place yourself under an oath with all of those implications to keep it. If you make the oath, you're bound to keep it. But the Jews found all their ways to get out of oaths and things like that because that's how they were. But that's serious business in their mind. They're so set on killing him, they vow, we won't eat or drink till he dies. It's either him or us. And we're going to place ourselves under an oath to do this. They go to the Sanhedrin, and they present this idea to the Sanhedrin to get their approval. What their plan is to use the Sanhedrin to call Paul the next day for further questioning, under this guise of bringing him from being in bonds now to bring him for further questioning. Meanwhile, they would be at their post outside of the judgment hall, and once Paul was brought, they would ambush him and they would kill him. That's their plan. But God's already said that's not going to happen to you in Jerusalem. God's implied to Paul, don't be alarmed. You're going to make it to Rome and testify there as well. And God, through His providence, intercedes and allows this plan to just fall apart and Paul to survive. Notice there, point B, verses 16 to 22, that Paul's nephew warns the Romans. Somebody pick up in verse 16 and read down to verse 22 and notice how this situation continues.
Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready and waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things."
All right. Now you got to think about these men. You have to commend them for their zeal, really. I mean, you have to commend them for their zeal. They had some extreme zeal. They were so zealous about killing Paul that they bound themselves to an oath, and they refused to eat or drink until the moment they killed Paul. That's extreme zeal, but of course zeal needs to be tempered by knowledge. We need to be zealous, but we need to have our zeal controlled by a knowledge and understanding of God's will. Their zeal was not in line with God's will. It was far out of step with God's will. Is it possible today for us to be zealous, but our zeal not be in line with God's word? Isn't that very much possible? There's a lot of religious individuals who, in a lot of ways, have much more zeal than we have. Let's just admit it. They have a lot more zeal than we have, but yet their zeal is not in line fully with God's word. We need to balance that. Zeal and knowledge. Romans 10, Paul talks about his own Jewish kinsmen. how they had a zeal for God, a zeal towards God, but it was not according to knowledge. They were ignorant of God's righteousness, and they were going about to establish their own righteousness through the law of Moses. Let's be like these folks in the sense of zeal, but let's not be like them in ignoring and dishonoring God's will. Let's let our zeal be controlled by God's will. But even their zeal was no match for God's providence. God somehow, some way enabled, verse 16, Paul's nephew to learn about this plot. Of all people, to learn about this plot and be able to step in and do something about it, it was Paul's own nephew. Now, we're not told a lot about this individual. In fact, we're told very little about him. We have a lot of questions that we would love to have answers to, like, is this man a Christian? And what's his background? Was he a preacher of the gospel? Was he an elder in the Lord's church? What about him? We don't know. But we know he's here, and we know that somehow, in some way, God used him to learn of this plot and be able to step in. He takes this knowledge that he's now received straight to the Romans. He knows the Romans would not approve of this. The Romans are trying to do things lawfully. They have no agenda really here with Paul. They want to find the facts. They want to figure out why he's causing such an uproar everywhere he goes. What's going on here? Let's try him properly. So they wouldn't approve of that. So he brings this knowledge to them, and with great urgency tells them, here's the plot. And it's very probable that these men are already at their post. And if you don't do something now with this knowledge, it's very possible that if you allow Paul to go, and you allow these lying Jews to take him, he'll be killed. And so immediately, this captain begins to act. So we'll notice our next point here, Paul and the captain. The situation's urgent, the situation's dire. The captain's now received this information, and he's going to do something about it. This situation is just escalating right and left, and it's out of his control right now. And so he's going to commend this in the hands of the governor. So Paul and the captain, verses 23 to 35. Notice point A, that Paul is sent to Caesarea. The Roman soldier here, the Roman captain, decides to send Paul as well as a letter to Felix to Caesarea. Somebody pick up in verse 23 and read down to verse 30 for us.
And he called unto him two centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 80, and spearmen 200, and at the third hour of the night. And provide them beasts, that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter after this manner, Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor, Felix Senius. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army, and accused and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause, therefore they accused him, I brought him forth unto the council. Whom I perceived to be accused of questions of the law, but that of nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bond. And when it was told me that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to the accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell.
All right, so something amazing is happening here. We are now introduced to this man named Felix. Felix was the provincial governor of this area. In essence, the Roman soldier realizes this situation has now gotten far beyond what I can handle. And I'm going to recommend this in the hands now of the governor himself. This situation is escalating. In all of this, I have found nothing that Paul's worthy of being even imprisoned or put to death for. They're just arguing about laws, and they're trying to kill Paul without this due process of law and all these things. And so he's commending Paul into his hands. And he sends Paul, along with this letter of what's happening, to Caesarea, to Felix, with a full military escort. I mean, he takes 200 soldiers, verse 23, and 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They do this at the third hour of the night, so about 9 p.m. So in the cover of night, the cover of darkness, they take Paul and they travel with his full military escort to Caesarea with Paul the prisoner and this letter in hand. Well, notice what happens, point B. Paul awaits his hearing. When Paul arrives in Caesarea, Paul has to wait. Paul is not able to get this trial yet. He's not able to really even have charges brought against him yet. He has to wait. So Paul awaits his hearing. Somebody pick up in verse 31 and read down to verse 35.
So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province was he from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers rise. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium.
All right, so Paul is now here in Caesarea. Felix the governor has received the letter. He's read the letter, but before he's going to go ahead with this and give this prisoner a hearing, he wants to understand the province he's from, and he learns that he's from Cilicia and vows to give him a fair trial. But he has to wait around for what? Verse 35. What's he having to wait on? His accusers to arise. Exactly right. They have to get there, which will be about 5 days later. So for 5 days, Paul's going to have to wait around here imprisoned in Caesarea until he is able to have his accusers come, and this process begins now in Caesarea. We're going to learn a lot more next week in chapter 24 about this interesting man named Felix. It's amazing how, as we saw in our Philippians class this month, the Monday Night Motivation, that in all of this situation, God used Paul to preach the gospel. Paul made that point. I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. In all these situations, God allowed Paul to experience what he experienced, and in so doing, put people before him, before whom he could preach the gospel, such as the Romans, and now even Felix, and then on to Agrippa, and so forth and so on throughout the end of this book. We're getting very close to Paul's imprisonment. And we just keep on learning more and more about God's providence and how God took care of him and used this situation for his ultimate good and gospel to be preached. There's 3 application questions there, and I think that's the most important part of this class. And I do hope and pray that you all go home and reread the chapter and then take a few minutes to do those questions. It's 3 questions. Won't take you very long at all. And now that you have an introduction to this chapter, a brief synopsis of it, now that we've gone through it and explored it and examined it, you have some things to work with to sit now and apply it to your life and make some very good application to your life before God. So we'll put a peg down right now, and we'll come back next Sunday morning and begin with Acts chapter 24. We're dismissed.